A decorated federal agent, badge on his belt, gun on his hip, credentials in his hand, was dragged across the asphalt by 4 officers who refused to listen. He was not a suspect, not a criminal, but a man who had spent years hunting them. When they left, nothing would ever be the same again. If any careers ended, one city would be bankrupted. And the officer who started it all never saw it coming. This is the story of Special Agent David Brooks, and it is every bit as brutal as it sounds. The air carried the promise of rain that had not yet fallen. The streets around the West Side Warehouse District in Barrow County, Georgia, stood mostly quiet, broken only by the occasional rumble of a freight truck grinding through its gears on Highway 316. Special Agent David Brooks sat in a rented Chevy Silverado, deliberately chosen to look like the kind of truck a drug buyer might drive, parked at the edge of a gravel lot behind a defunct auto parts warehouse. His phone rested on his thigh, its screen dimmed to the lowest setting. On the seat beside him lay a worn leather jacket, a half-eaten granola bar, and a federal surveillance file marked with the bold red stamp, Operation Ironclad. David was a graduate of Howard University and the FBI Academy at Quantico. A man who had spent years embedded in some of the most dangerous criminal networks operating in the American South. He had broken the Castellano drug pipeline out of Miami. He had infiltrated a white-collar arms trafficking ring in Birmingham. He had testified before a federal grand jury multiple times and never lost a single case. That evening, he stood on the verge of closing the biggest operation of his career. The Westbrook Cartel, a loosely affiliated network of mid-level drug distributors operating across 6 Georgia counties, had been under FBI surveillance for some time. David had spent the undercover phase working his way into the confidence of a man named Jake Reynolds, a former Army logistics officer who now ran distribution out of 4 seemingly legitimate small businesses. The buy that would flip Jake needed only one final handoff to confirm the location of a secondary warehouse where the FBI believed the bulk of the cartel's product was being staged. He was alone in the car because that was the protocol. No backup visible, no markings, nothing to spook the subjects. A Barrow County police cruiser rolled slowly through the parking lot. David noticed it but did not react. He was used to patrol officers circling areas like this. He kept his eyes on the warehouse loading dock, one hand resting casually on his knee. The cruiser stopped, then reversed. Its spotlight snapped on, flooding the cab of the Silverado with blinding white light. David exhaled slowly through his nose. He understood exactly what this looked like. A black man alone in a truck in an industrial district after dark. He had dealt with this kind of stop before. He knew the procedure. He placed both hands on the steering wheel, visible and still, and waited. Officer Ryan Harper stepped out of the cruiser. He was a young man with a square jaw and the confident stride of someone who had never once questioned whether he might be wrong about something. Behind him, his partner, Officer Chris Lawson, exited the passenger side and moved to position himself behind the truck. Harper approached the driver's window with his hand resting on his holster. "Sir, roll down the window. Step out of the vehicle." David rolled down the window. He did not step out. Instead, very slowly and deliberately, he spoke first. "Officer, I need to inform you that I am a federal law enforcement agent. I'm going to reach into my jacket and show you my credentials. Please do not be alarmed." There was a pause. Harper's eyes narrowed. "I said, step out of the vehicle. Now. Step out now." David kept his voice measured. "I am Special Agent David Brooks with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I am on an active surveillance operation in this area. I need you to call your supervisor before the situation escalates." Harper glanced back at Lawson. Something passed between them. Not caution, not uncertainty, but something closer to irritation. The irritation of a man who does not like to be corrected by the person he has already decided is subordinate to him. "Get out of the vehicle," Harper said again, louder this time. "Last warning." David slowly reached for his jacket pocket. "I'm reaching for my credentials. Hands now." Harper drew his weapon. Everything that happened next unfolded in a blur. David Brooks was pulled from the Silverado with his hands up, his FBI badge and credentials in plain sight, still speaking calmly to two officers who had already made up their minds. "I'm a federal agent. My badge number is—" "Shut up. Hands behind your back. My supervising agent is Lisa Morgan. Her number is in my phone. Please call her. You don't comply, we add resisting to the charge." What charge? What am I being charged with? Nobody answered that question. Not then. Officer Lawson found the surveillance file on the seat. He held it up, the red Operation Ironclad stamp clearly visible, and showed it to Harper. A reasonable person at that moment would have stopped, would have taken a breath and said, "Wait, let's think about this." Harper was not a reasonable person that evening. "Could be anything," he said. "Book him." David was handcuffed and placed in the back of the police cruiser. His phone, his direct link to the FBI field office in Atlanta, was placed in an evidence bag. His badge, his credentials, his weapon, his surveillance file, all of it bagged and tagged and locked in a patrol vehicle trunk. The charge eventually scrolled onto the intake form at Barrow County P. D read suspicious activity, failure to comply, trespassing. He was not on private property. The parking lot was public access. Sergeant Tom Riley was the watch supervisor that evening, a man close to retirement who had spent the last stretch in the comfortable fog of administrative routine. When Harper radioed in the arrest, Riley asked two questions. Is he armed? Yes. Is he in custody? Yes. Then he approved the booking without asking a single follow-up question. Not about the badge, not about the credentials, not about the federal documents sitting in the evidence bag. Special Agent David Brooks was processed into the Barrow County Detention Facility and placed in a holding cell. Officer Chris Lawson went back to the Silverado, found a secondary phone David used for undercover work, and turned off the FBI tracking beacon attached to the vehicle's undercarriage, though he would later claim he had simply moved the vehicle and not known what the device was. The holding cell smelled like industrial cleaner and old fear. There were 4 other men in it, 2 who appeared to be intoxicated, 1 who was clearly in medical distress and wasn't receiving attention, and 1 who sat perfectly still in the corner and said nothing. David sat on the metal bench, his back straight, his mind running through everything he knew. He had the right to a phone call. He knew that. What he didn't know, what he had no way of knowing, was that the desk officer processing him had logged his request for a phone call, looked at the name on the booking form, looked at the clock, and decided it could wait until the shift supervisor gave the say-so. That supervisor was Sergeant Riley, who was currently eating a sandwich in his office and watching a college basketball replay. David asked multiple times over the course of the first stretch to speak to someone, on anyone in authority. The officer who appeared at the cell door each time gave the same answer. "Someone will be with you shortly." No one came. Meanwhile, in the West Side Warehouse District, the handoff David had spent months positioning himself to witness took place without him. Jake Reynolds received the shipment, signed off on it with the kind of casual confidence that comes from knowing the coast is clear, and drove away. The secondary warehouse location, the one piece of the puzzle the FBI needed, remained unknown. Operation Ironclad was compromised. Inside the cell, David did not panic. He was trained not to panic. But as events accumulated, a cold, methodical anger began to replace the professional calm. The next time an officer came to the cell door, he would not ask politely. He would state clearly, and for the record, exactly who he was and what the consequences of this detention would be. He would be specific. He would be precise. He would give them one final opportunity to correct a mistake that was still technically correctable. Officer Megan Hayes appeared at the cell for a routine welfare check. She looked through the bars at the man on the bench, a man who looked nothing like the other occupants of the cell, a man sitting with the composed stillness of someone who had been trained to wait. "You need anything?" she asked. "Yes," David said. "I need you to call the Atlanta field office of the FBI. The number is there. Tell them that Special Agent David Brooks has been detained at this facility and request that they contact Deputy Director Anthony Reed immediately." "Can you do that?" Hayes blinked. "I'll pass the message along. I need you to make the call yourself right now from this hallway. I'll wait." Something in his voice, the absolute certainty of it, the absence of desperation or bluster, made her pause. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she walked back down the hallway, found Sergeant Riley, and repeated what the man in the cell had told her. Riley chewed his sandwich. If he were FBI, they'd have already called looking for him. He says his phone was taken as evidence. Then he'll get his call in the morning. Hayes went back to her rounds, but she did not forget the conversation. And later, she would be the one person in Barrow County PD who would not face termination. Because unlike everyone else in that building that evening, she had at least tried. Captain Robert Klein arrived at the station for an early shift. Klein was a veteran, the kind of man who used phrases like "by the book" and "chain of command" as shields against having to think independently. When Riley briefed him on the arrest, including the fact that the suspect had claimed to be a federal agent, Klein's response was telling. "He say anything else?" "Keeps asking for a phone call." "What are the charges?" "Suspicious activity, failure to comply, trespassing." Klein nodded. "Hold him till morning. We'll sort it out in daylight." 6 words that would eventually cost Robert Klein his pension, his reputation, and very nearly his freedom. David Brooks had been in custody, back at the FBI field office in Atlanta. Special Agent Lisa Morgan, David's supervising agent and the person listed as his emergency contact in the Bureau's internal system, had arrived for a briefing on Operation Ironclad. She was expecting a check-in from David, who had been scheduled to call with surveillance notes. No call had come. She tried his phone. Voicemail. She tried his undercover phone. Nothing. She pinged the tracking beacon on the Silverado. It returned no signal. Lisa Morgan had worked alongside David Brooks for years. She knew his habits, his protocols, his discipline. The man did not miss check-ins, not ever. She called Deputy Director Anthony Reed at home. Anthony Reed was a second-generation Nigerian-American who had grown up in Columbus, Ohio, attended Yale Law, spent decades climbing the FBI ladder, and now served as the Deputy Director of the Atlanta field office, which oversaw federal operations across 4 southeastern states. He was also a man known among those who knew him well for a particular quality. Once he decided something needed to be done, nothing in the world moved faster than his execution of it. He picked up on the second ring. "Tell me," he said. Lisa told him. 3 FBI vehicles were on their way to Barrow County. They did not use sirens. That was the detail people would remember later. Those who were there. Those who saw it happen. 3 black SUVs rolling through the streets of Barrow County, Georgia without a sound. Just lights and purpose. Deputy Director Anthony Reed walked through the front door of the Barrow County Police Department. Behind him were 8 federal agents, 3 of whom carried what would later be described in departmental records as a significant volume of legal documentation. The desk officer, a man named Gary Prout, who had been working the overnight shift for years and had seen nothing remotely like this, rose from his chair and opened his mouth. Reed did not slow down. "Where is Special Agent David Brooks?" It was not a question. It had the grammar of a question, but the weight of an ultimatum. Gary Prout, to his credit, answered immediately. "Cell Block B, sir. Sir, who are—" Reed held up his credentials without breaking stride. The FBI found Captain Robert Klein in his office, coffee in hand, reviewing a patrol schedule. When the door opened and he saw Reed, 6 feet tall, immaculate in a charcoal suit, radiating the specific kind of controlled fury that comes from a man who has learned to weaponize his composure, Klein set the coffee down slowly, very slowly. "Captain Klein," Reed said, "you are currently holding a federal law enforcement officer in one of your cells. You have been holding him. He is on an active undercover operation that your officers have now compromised. I am going to need you to release him immediately, and then I am going to need you to sit in that chair and not make any phone calls. Do you understand me?" Klein's mouth moved. No sound came out. "Captain?" "Yes." Klein said, "Yes, I understand." David Brooks was released from the cell. He walked out of the cell block into the hallway and stopped when he saw Reed. The 2 men looked at each other for a moment. David still in the clothes he had been wearing during surveillance, his jaw tight, his eyes carrying the particular kind of exhaustion that has nothing to do with sleep. "You all right?" Reed asked. "No," David said. "Not even a little bit." Reed nodded. "Good. I need you honest today." He placed a hand briefly on David's shoulder. "Your operation, is it salvageable?" David thought about Jake Reynolds driving away, about the handoff he had missed, about months of work. "Not in its current form," he said. The word that Reed used in response is not one that appears in the official record, but everyone in the hallway heard it. Chief Gary Thompson had been woken by a call from Captain Klein. The story Klein told him was already beginning to compress and reshape itself, the way stories do when the people telling them are frightened. Klein's version: 2 officers had responded to a suspicious vehicle call. The occupant had been uncooperative. The arrest had followed standard protocol. Nobody had known he was FBI. An honest mistake. Chief Gary Thompson, a portly man in his early 60s who had run Barrow County PD for years, largely by avoiding controversy, arrived at the station to find it already swarming with federal agents. He was met in the parking lot by Special Agent Lisa Morgan, who handed him a single sheet of paper. It was a timeline, minute by minute, reconstructed from cell tower data, the booking system's internal logs, surveillance footage from inside the facility, and the radio dispatch records. Thompson read it. His face went slowly from pink to gray. "The body cams," he said, "from the arresting officers." "We've already requested them," Morgan said pleasantly. "Both cameras were off during the arrest." There was a pause. "Both of them," Thompson repeated. "Both of them simultaneously, which is coincidentally exactly minutes after Officer Harper spotted the vehicle in the parking lot and radioed his partner. This was not a coincidence. Under Barrow County PD policy written, signed, and distributed by Gary Thompson himself, body cameras were required to be activated during any field contact with a civilian. The deactivation of 2 cameras at the same moment, minutes before an arrest, was not an equipment malfunction. It was a decision. What no one in the Barrow County PD had accounted for, what Ryan Harper and Chris Lawson had specifically not accounted for, was the parking lot across the street from the warehouse. It belonged to a cold storage logistics company called Southern Star Cold Storage. Southern Star had upgraded its exterior security system months earlier, installing 4 high-definition cameras with a field of view that extended well beyond their own property line. The cameras were motion-activated and stored days of footage on a private server. FBI forensic technicians pulled the footage. What they found was comprehensive, unambiguous, and devastating. The footage showed David Brooks' hands raised the entire time. It showed him speaking calmly, clearly to both officers. It showed him reaching slowly with explicit verbal warning for his jacket pocket. It showed Officer Harper looking directly at the FBI credentials in David's hand. Not glancing, not glimpsing, looking for full seconds. And then it showed Harper turning to Lawson with a particular expression. An expression that would be described by 2 separate behavioral analysts in subsequent proceedings as contempt. Before saying something that the camera's audio, partially captured by the upgraded microphones, preserved as 2 words, "Doesn't matter." Those 2 words became the center of gravity around which everything else collapsed. FBI forensic accountant Rachel Bennett, brought in by Reed's team, began pulling Barrow County PD personnel records. What she found would expand the scope of the investigation far beyond one bad arrest on one night. Ryan Harper had multiple prior complaints filed against him. All had been reviewed by Sergeant Tom Riley. All had been dismissed with a notation. Officer exercised appropriate judgment given field conditions. Chris Lawson had complaints. Same reviewer, same notation. Over recent years, officers in Barrow County PD had accumulated complaints that had been reviewed and dismissed by one of 3 supervisors: Riley, a lieutenant named Mark Donovan, and Captain Robert Klein himself. The complaints, when Bennett laid them out chronologically and demographically, formed a pattern that required no statistical expertise to interpret. Of the complaints filed involving use of excessive force or unlawful detention, the vast majority involved Black or Latino residents. Of those, 0 had resulted in disciplinary action. 0. The David Brooks arrest was not an aberration. It was the system functioning exactly as it had been allowed to function. Mayor Richard Hale arrived at the police station. He was accompanied by the city's senior attorney, a meticulous man in his late 50s, who had handled municipal legal affairs for years and had a gift for reading rooms. The attorney took one look at the number of federal agents, the volume of files being copied, and the expression on Deputy Director Anthony Reed's face, and leaned toward Mayor Hale. "Richard," he said quietly, "we're going to need to talk about settlement figures." Hale, who had spent the previous stretch campaigning for a road resurfacing bond, looked at him blankly. "What kind of figures?" The attorney did not answer right away. He was doing mental arithmetic, the kind that involves jury verdicts and federal civil rights statutes, and the going rate for high-profile wrongful detention cases with documented racial bias, compromised undercover operations, and Southern Star cold storage camera footage, large ones. The FBI's formal referral to the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division arrived. The referral was lengthy, meticulously footnoted, and attached to it as appendices were the Southern Star cold storage footage, the reconstructed timeline, Rachel Bennett's complaint pattern analysis, the audio capture of "Doesn't Matter," and a sworn affidavit from Special Agent David Brooks that ran to pages and read, according to a federal judge who would later review it, with the precision of a prosecutorial brief, because David had written every word of it himself, working through nights, channeling the hours in that cell into pages of documented, sequenced, legally structured account. The DOJ investigation ran parallel to an internal affairs review conducted by Georgia's Peace Officer Standards and Training Council, which had been contacted by Reed's office the morning of the arrest. The investigator assigned to the case was a woman named Jessica Kane, a former Fulton County detective who had spent years investigating officer misconduct and had a reputation for thoroughness that her colleagues described variously as admirable or terrifying, depending on which side of her desk they sat on. Jessica Kane spent time in Barrow County. She interviewed dozens of people. She pulled every document the department had generated in recent years. She attended city council sessions and sat in the back of the room taking notes with the quiet focus of someone who already knows what she is looking for and is simply building the path to it. During her investigation, she found something that had nothing to do with David Brooks. Buried in a batch of evidence room logs, Kane found a discrepancy. Cases in which items listed as seized evidence had no corresponding disposition records. The evidence had been logged in. It had never been logged out. But in those cases, the criminal charges had been quietly dropped. She pulled the arresting officer reports for all cases. Several of them were signed by Ryan Harper. When Jessica Kane brought this to Captain Robert Klein, he told her it was a clerical error. When she brought it to Chief Gary Thompson, he told her it was an ongoing internal matter. When she brought it to Deputy Director Anthony Reed, he picked up his phone and called the U.S. Attorney for the Northern District of Georgia, a woman named Susan Caldwell, who cleared her afternoon schedule and asked Reed to have Jessica Kane in her office. Ryan Harper, it emerged, had been skimming seized drug evidence. Small amounts, enough to sell. Not enough to obviously flag. He had been doing it for years. Sergeant Tom Riley had, the evidence would eventually suggest, known about it and had used that knowledge to ensure Harper's complaints were always dismissed. Because a Harper who feared Riley was a Harper who stayed quiet about Riley's own secondary income, a protection arrangement with 2 local businesses that allowed them to avoid noise ordinance enforcement in exchange for monthly cash payments. The thread, once pulled, unraveled faster than anyone anticipated. Lieutenant Mark Donovan had falsified overtime records. Captain Robert Klein had approved a no-bid contract for police vehicle maintenance to a company owned by his brother-in-law. 3 other officers had used department databases to run unauthorized searches on private citizens. In 2 cases, on individuals involved in personal disputes with the officers. The arrest of David Brooks had not been the beginning of the rot. It had been the moment someone shone a light on a rot that had been spreading quietly. The termination proceedings began. Officer Ryan Harper terminated. Criminally charged with evidence tampering, civil rights violations under federal statute, and theft of government property. Bail set high. Officer Chris Lawson terminated. Criminally charged with civil rights violations and obstruction of justice for disabling the beacon. Bail set accordingly. Sergeant Tom Riley terminated, criminally charged with conspiracy, evidence tampering, and corruption. Bail set higher. Lieutenant Mark Donovan terminated, criminally charged with fraud and falsification of records. Captain Robert Klein terminated, under investigation for corruption and contracting fraud. Criminal charges pending. Chief Gary Thompson forced resignation. No criminal charges, but no pension either, following a determination by the city that his failure to investigate prior complaints constituted a breach of his employment contract. Officer Megan Hayes, the one who had tried, was not only cleared but promoted. Additional officers received disciplinary actions ranging from suspension to demotion, based on findings related to the complaint suppression pattern and the database misuse. 17 badges total gone. And it was not done yet. City Attorney Paul Bennett had seen the settlement number coming from the moment he walked into that police station on the morning after the arrest. What he had not fully accounted for was the multiplier effect. The way a single case, when it cracks open correctly, does not stay a single case. David Brooks retained a private attorney within hours of his release. A woman named Nicole Parker, a civil rights litigator based in Atlanta, who had won multiple landmark wrongful arrest cases and was known in Georgia legal circles for a willingness to push every case to trial rather than accept a quiet settlement, because she understood, as she once told an interviewer, that quiet settlements are what cities use to buy silence. Nicole Parker filed a federal civil rights lawsuit against Barrow County on behalf of David Brooks. The lawsuit named the county, the city, Chief Thompson, Captain Klein, Officer Harper, and Officer Lawson as defendants. It alleged violations of the Fourth Amendment, the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, and the federal civil rights statutes, including a specific claim under federal code and a Bivens-adjacent theory that applied to the systemic nature of the misconduct. The prayer for relief sought millions. The city, on the advice of every lawyer in its orbit, immediately signaled willingness to negotiate. What followed were weeks of negotiation that Paul Bennett later described in a moment of unusual candor at a Georgia Bar Association dinner as the most humbling experience of his professional life. Every time the city came to the table with a number, Nicole Parker thanked them politely and laid another piece of evidence on the table. The Southern Star footage, the complaint pattern analysis, the evidence room discrepancies, the audio clip of Doesn't Matter. And then, weeks into negotiations, a development that no one had anticipated. Other individuals came forward. Not FBI agents, not lawyers, not people with Nicole Parker's resources or David Brooks's institutional backing. Residents of Barrow County, black men and women ranging in age who had experienced wrongful arrests, unlawful detentions, or excessive force at the hands of Barrow County PD. People who had filed complaints and been dismissed. People who had never filed complaints because they had not believed anyone would listen. People who had seen the news coverage of the Brooks case, because by then it was everywhere, and recognized in it the shape of something that had happened to them. Nicole Parker, with David Brooks' explicit blessing and active encouragement, absorbed additional cases into an amended complaint. The others retained separate counsel. By the time the consolidated lawsuit was filed in federal court, it represented multiple plaintiffs with documented, corroborated claims against the same systemic pattern of misconduct. The city's exposure increased dramatically. Mayor Richard Hale, who had been up for re-election, called a press conference. He read a prepared statement about accountability and reform, and the city's commitment to justice. When a reporter asked him why it had taken a federal agent being arrested for the city to look at its own police department, Hale paused for a long time before saying that he deeply regretted the gaps in oversight that had allowed the situation to develop. The reporter's follow-up question, "Were you aware of the complaint suppression pattern prior to this investigation?" was met with a response from Hale's communications director that the mayor would take no further questions. Richard Hale lost his re-election bid. His opponent ran on a single-issue platform: police accountability. She won every precinct in the city except one. Settlement negotiations concluded. Barrow County agreed to pay millions distributed as follows: millions to David Brooks for wrongful arrest, civil rights violations, and the documented compromise of Operation Ironclad. Millions to the additional plaintiffs whose cases were consolidated into the amended complaint, plus a non-financial settlement package that included mandatory department-wide retraining, the installation of body camera accountability software that flagged any deactivation outside designated zones, independent oversight of the complaint review process, and a formal written apology signed by the acting police chief, the city attorney, and the mayor entered into the public record. Nicole Parker read the apology at a press conference. She read it slowly, every word, into a bank of microphones while David Brooks stood beside her. He was quiet during the press conference. Several reporters commented on it later. The stillness of him, the lack of visible triumph. One journalist described him as a man who had won a war and was still calculating the cost. Operation Ironclad, in its original form, was over. The surveillance, the undercover work, the relationship with Jake Reynolds, all of it gone, burned by the time in a holding cell. The FBI rebuilt the operation from a different angle, and while the Bureau's official position was that the new approach was viable, David knew, and Reed knew, and Lisa Morgan knew that the version of the case they eventually brought to court was materially diminished from what it might have been. Jake Reynolds was eventually arrested, but on lesser charges. He pleaded to a single count of distribution and received a sentence that in David's estimation was roughly a fraction of what a fully executed Operation Ironclad would have delivered. That was the cost that never appeared in the settlement. The cost measured not in money, but in criminals who walked lighter than they should have, because officers turned off their cameras that evening. What happened to Ryan Harper in the time that followed is the part of this story that people who believe in karma tell with a particular quiet satisfaction. His criminal trial began. His defense attorney argued that the arrest had been a good faith mistake, that Officer Harper had not known David Brooks was a federal agent, and that the subsequent evidence room discrepancies were the result of administrative confusion rather than theft. The jury did not agree. The Southern Star cold storage footage played for the jury made "doesn't matter" the most important two words in the courtroom. The prosecution argued that those two words, spoken after Harper had visually confirmed the credentials, removed any possibility of good faith error. This was not a mistake. This was a choice. Ryan Harper was convicted on multiple counts: civil rights violation under color of law, evidence tampering, and theft of government property. He was sentenced to years in federal prison. Chris Lawson pleaded guilty to obstruction and received months. Tom Riley, whose cooperation with federal investigators in exchange for a reduced charge had already burned every bridge he had in law enforcement, was convicted on conspiracy and corruption counts. He reported to a federal correctional facility. His retirement pension, the thing he had spent years carefully protecting by suppressing complaints, was forfeited. Robert Klein's case moved slower. The contracting fraud was complicated, the evidence circumstantial in places. But the U.S. Attorney's Office was patient, and patient is a word that means something specific when they use it. Klein eventually pleaded to a reduced charge, paid a fine, and was barred from public employment in the state of Georgia. Gary Thompson, living on reduced income, gave one interview after his resignation in which he said that, with the benefit of hindsight, he could see that standards had slipped. The interview was shared widely online, largely by people who found the phrase "standards" had slipped an inadequate accounting for years of documented racial bias in his department. He did not give another interview. The offer came over coffee in the kind of quiet corner booth at an Atlanta diner that people choose specifically because it is unlikely to be remembered. The administrator who made the offer, a decent man, David thought, a man with genuinely good intentions and a genuine belief that what he was suggesting was a kindness, slid a folder across the table and described in careful and measured language a senior advisory position within the FBI's training division. Washington-based, prestigious, the kind of role that looked from the outside like a promotion, the kind of role that was from the inside a room with no windows. It was the Bureau's way of protecting one of its own by placing him somewhere safe, somewhere quiet, somewhere the next Ryan Harper could not find him in a parking lot after dark. David listened to the entire pitch without interrupting. He drank his coffee. He looked at the folder but didn't open it. Then he thanked the man across from him, slid the folder back, and said with no drama and no hesitation, "I appreciate what you're trying to do, but I'm going back to the field." The administrator looked at him for a long moment. "David, I'm going back to the field," he said again. And that was the end of that conversation. What David did with the money is the part of the story that people close to him will tell you matters more than anything else. More than the settlement figure. More than the terminations. More than the footage from the Southern Star cameras that made 2 words into a federal court exhibit. He kept enough to buy a house, a modest one, in a quiet neighborhood in southwest Atlanta with a backyard that backed up against a stand of Georgia pines and a front porch. He had always told himself he would eventually make time to sit on. He bought it outright, no mortgage, because he had spent years living in rented apartments and motel rooms and undercover identities. And he wanted for the first time in his adult life something that was simply and permanently his. The rest of it, millions, he gave away. Not to charity in the abstract, distant sense of a check written to an institution. He gave it to something specific, something built, something that would function and fight and continue to exist after the news cycle moved on. Working alongside Nicole Parker, who donated a significant portion of her own fee from the case. A decision that surprised everyone except those who knew her well. David established the Barrow Fund. The name was deliberate and it was debated. More than one person in David's circle suggested naming it something aspirational, something forward-looking, something that did not carry the weight of a county that had put him in a cell. David disagreed. He wanted the name to do something. He wanted every person who encountered it to ask what Barrow was, and then to have to sit with the answer. Shame that doesn't change anything, he told Nicole when they were finalizing the paperwork. If this fund does its job, Barrow County spends the next stretch being known for 2 things. What it did and what it cost them. Both of those things need to live in the name. Nicole had agreed. She had also pointed out with the practical clarity that made her extraordinary at her work, that a fund name for a county's failure and attached to a multi-million-dollar settlement verdict would have no difficulty generating press coverage for its cases. She was right. She usually was. The Barrow Fund's stated mission was precise. Legal representation for low-income residents of Georgia who had experienced police misconduct with a particular focus on cases in which the internal complaint process had been used not to address wrongdoing, but to bury it. The focus on complaint suppression was intentional. It was the thing more than the bad arrests, more than the individual officers that David had decided was the actual disease. Individual misconduct was a symptom. The machinery that made it invisible was the disease. In its first stretch, the fund took on cases. It won most of them, recovering millions in additional settlements for Georgia residents who had been filing complaints into the void for years. Several of those cases involved the same county, not Barrow. A different one where an almost identical complaint suppression pattern had been operating invisible until the fund's investigators started pulling the records. The other cases were still active when the fund's first annual report was published. Nicole Parker's note in the foreword of that report said in part, "We did not take the cases because we thought we would win them easily. We took them because they were right." The Barrow Fund does not select cases based on probability of victory. It selects them based on whether someone's rights were violated and whether they deserve to have someone stand beside them when they say so. Jessica Kane joined the fund's advisory board. Her contribution was not ceremonial. She brought with her a methodology for complaint pattern analysis that she had refined over years of investigations. A methodology that became the fund's primary investigative framework for identifying systemic misconduct before cases went to court. The board met quarterly, but Jessica and David talked more often than that. They had, in the way of people who have worked the same problem from different angles, developed an unusual mutual respect. "You ever regret going back to the field?" she asked him once over the phone during one of their irregular check-ins. "Every time I'm in a parking lot after dark," he said. And then the next morning, no. The letter from Officer Megan Hayes arrived on a morning. It was handwritten on plain paper and had been rewritten several times based on the faint erasure marks visible on certain lines. It was the letter of someone who had been trying to say something for a long time and had finally decided that the discomfort of saying it was less than the weight of staying silent. Hayes wrote that she thought about that evening every single day. She wrote that she replayed the conversation in the hallway, the one at the cell door, and ran through every version of what she could have done differently. She could have made the call herself right there in the hallway instead of taking the message to Riley. She could have pushed back harder when Riley dismissed it. She could have documented the request formally instead of relying on a verbal exchange that left her word against the sergeant's. She wrote that she understood why she had not done those things, the weight of the hierarchy, the early stage of the job, the particular paralysis of being new enough to doubt yourself in every situation. But that understanding why had not made it easier to live with. She wrote that she hoped the small thing she had tried to do in that hallway had meant something. David read the letter twice. Then he sat at the kitchen table of the house in southwest Atlanta with Georgia sunshine coming through the window, and he wrote back, handwritten pages. He told her that what she had done in that hallway was not a small thing. He told her that in every complex situation he had been involved in professionally, and there had been many across years of federal work, the determining moral variable was never the person with the most power or the clearest authority. It was always the person with the least of both who chose, in a moment that cost them something, to act as though doing right mattered more than doing safe. He told her that Riley had had the authority and the seniority and the institutional cover to do the right thing that evening and had chosen not to. She had had almost none of those things and had chosen differently. That difference was not small. That difference was, in his view, the entire definition of character. He told her about the Barrow Fund. He told her about the cases. He told her that every single one of those cases had begun with someone deciding against the weight of habit and hierarchy and the path of least resistance that someone's rights were worth speaking about. He told her that the evening had cost him something real and significant. Months of operational work. A case that should have put a man away for longer and instead delivered a fraction of that. Sleep for a period. A particular kind of trust in the ordinary safety of ordinary situations. The kind of trust that once punctured takes longer to rebuild than any settlement can measure. And then he told her that it had also given him something. Not in spite of what happened. Not as a silver lining, which he found to be a fundamentally dishonest frame, but as a consequence of what he chose to do in the aftermath. The fund, the cases, the people who had had someone stand beside them in a proceeding that, without the fund, they would have faced alone. None of that existed without that evening. He was not grateful for the evening. He would never be grateful for the evening. But he was clear-eyed about what it had produced. And being clear-eyed about what suffering produces without sanitizing the suffering, without pretending the cost was worth it, was, he had come to believe, as close to wisdom as he had ever managed. He signed the letter the way he signed everything professional. Special Agent David Brooks, FBI Atlanta Field Office. Then below that, he added a line he had never written on anything professional in his career. Thank you for the hallway. It mattered more than you know. Here is what David Brooks' story actually teaches us. Injustice rarely announces itself. It does not show up with a villain's theme music or obvious malice written across its face. It shows up as habit, as complacency, as a sergeant eating a sandwich while a man in a cell asks for a phone call. It shows up in boxes checked, cameras switched off, and complaints quietly filed and just as quietly buried. The Barrow County story is not unique, and that is precisely why it matters. Somewhere, right now, in some department, in some county in this country, A clock is ticking. The question is whether the Megan Hayeses in those departments will stop it before the FBI shows up, or whether the city will learn the price of complacency on a multi-million-dollar invoice. Here's what David Brooks' story actually teaches us, and it hits deep if you let it sink in. Injustice rarely storms in with dramatic music or obvious evil. It slips in quietly, wearing the familiar face of habit, routine, and small complacencies. It looks like a sergeant finishing his sandwich while a man in a holding cell politely asks for one phone call. It hides in cameras that suddenly stop recording, in complaints neatly filed away and forgotten, in officers who decide a badge in someone's hand doesn't matter. The real danger is not always the loud bully with a gun. It is the quiet system that protects him. The everyday choices that slowly normalize wrong until one ordinary evening turns into a life-altering injustice. Yet, even in that darkness, something powerful can rise. One young officer named Megan Hayes chose, in a single hallway moment, to speak up when it would have been safer to stay silent. Her small act of courage did not stop the harm that night, but it planted a seed. And from the pain David Brooks carried out of that cell, he built something lasting. The Barrow Fund, a beacon of real help for people whose voices had been buried for years. He turned personal cost into collective hope, proving that what breaks us does not have to define us. We get to decide what we build in the aftermath. That is the quiet, aching truth this story leaves us with. Character is revealed not when power is on your side, but when it is not. Courage often costs something. Integrity sometimes feels lonely. But those small, brave choices matter more than we know. They are the difference between a system that protects the powerful and one that finally protects the people it was built to serve. If David Brooks' journey moved you, if it stirred something in your chest about fairness, courage, and standing up even when it's hard, then do something with that feeling right now. Drop a comment below and tell me, what's one moment in your life when doing the right thing felt risky, but you did it anyway? Share your story. Let's remind each other that these small acts still matter. And if you want more real stories that make you think, feel, and maybe even change how you see the world, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. We're in this together. Let's keep shining light where it's needed most. Thank you for watching.